Mark Twain, Part 2. Yes, because we have talked about him, about his person, about his life, about his personality, but there is still so much to say about him. So please stay tuned. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel at Maiora. I'm so glad you're here for the second video about Mark Twain. The previous one is always in this playlist, which is the American Literature playlist. Okay, so on this channel, every single playlist is a course. Basically, there's the American Literature playlist, English Literature playlist, English language playlist, so you can easily navigate and navigate it and find what you need. So the previous one here is about Mark Twain, his life, his personality, his experiences, his works too. But there is so much to say about him. We have already mentioned the fact that he wasn't just a novelist, but he was also a journalist. He was also a philosopher, a humorist, a stand-up comedian, a moralist, a lecturer. So obviously he had a lot of interests, a lot of strong ideas. He was certainly he was an ideologist, and he communicated these ideas through different forms of literature, but literature wasn't actually his only interest. He had a lot of other interests, and one of them was actually technology. Not just technology, really, let's say technology and science. He was friends with Nikola Tesla. That's quite interesting because he was in contact with the real world of science. That wasn't something theoretical, okay? It was something that he could get in touch with. In fact, if you think about it, his work, Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, is definitely a story about time travel. So he was definitely fascinated by technology and science and the future possibilities. He was even a proponent, this is quite interesting, he was a proponent of fingerprinting in forensics. This is quite particular, okay, and that was quite interesting. But as far as his literary career is concerned, we have said many times in my previous videos that he was a master of light, humorous verse. But he was also let's say a chronicler. So he wrote chronicles about the vanities of his society, about hypocrisies, about murder, violence. So the tones were very different. He was like let's say a painter who used a lot of different colors, okay, to depict reality, his own society. Many of his works were actually suppressed for years because of censorship. For example, Huckleberry Finn, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, was actually censored, was banned also because of the use of the so-called N-word to define Afro-American people, which is obviously a terrible word, a bad word we should never use today, very negative. But it's quite strange because at the time, when he was writing and the way he used it was absolutely, it had a completely different meaning, let's say so, because Mark Twain, or Samuel Clemens, because we know that his real name was actually Samuel Clemens, he was absolutely against slavery. He supported rights for black people, for Afro-American people. He was was against slavery, he was an abolitionist. So he also used, sometimes he talked very clearly about that in his essays or speeches. Sometimes he used some of his characters in order to convey these messages. And Huckleberry Finn was one of these characters in a period, you know, civil war and all that, so when this topic was quite controversial, and he used his character, his pure-hearted character, to convey this message against slavery. And still the work was banned, was suppressed because of the use of this N-word that was considered offensive. So this is definitely, yeah, there's a bit of a contradiction here. However, as I said before, he was an abolitionist. Well, he wasn't, we can't say he wasn't a socialist, but he was a laborist for sure. He was almost against death penalty. Not 100% against that, but mostly against death penalty. Certainly he was against lynching. We talked about that before. He wrote some essays against some topics, like, for example, anti-Semitism or imperialism or the exploitation of Africa, and against lynching, which was a very common habit and practice at the time in the States. And so mostly he was also mostly against death penalty. I also mentioned that in my previous video. He strongly supported the rights of Afro-Americans, Native Americans, women, animals. He was against vivisection, for example. He was against imperialism, as I said before, especially the American imperialism. His attitude towards religion is a bit, well, that's not so easy to explain. Let's say that he came from a very Calvinist family, but he was very detached and ironic towards religion in general. He definitely wrote some anti-religion, heretical works, especially the letters from the earth that he wrote in his old age. They were definitely heretical, and they weren't published at the time. They were anti-religion for sure. I mean, he blamed God for everything bad that happens in the human life, and he, let's say that he considered Jesus Christ as the one who actually devised hell instead of Satan. So that was definitely heretical, and that was definitely anti-religion. And he was against the church, for sure. He was very satirical. But was he an atheist or agnostic? We are not quite sure about that. We know for sure that he had some sympathy for some religious figures, like, for example, Joan d'Arc. He wrote her biography, and he wrote this biography using another pen name, using another pseudonym, which is Sir Louis de Conte. As I said before, but I'll repeat it now, he used different pen names. He used his real name, his true name, for many years when he was a journalist. Then he decided to use Mark Twain as a pen name, but he also used other ones, like in this case. And he decided also to decided to publish some of his works anonymously, because he thought that maybe they were too scandalous at the time, or he wanted those works to be published posthumously, so after his death, for the same reason. So let's say it's quite difficult today to keep track of every single work he wrote for this reason. But now, again, talking about his life again, we know that he had to face financial troubles and failures and deaths throughout all his life. It started with his father and his dad's, and we know that his father had this, this sort of a visionary and sort of ideal conception of life and business as well. And probably, let's say that Clemens, or Mark Twain if you prefer, took some of it from his father. Anyway, he faced bankrupt because his publishing house failed, and that's what is especially because of a typewriter that was incomplete and didn't work. Against his love for technology, didn't always repay him, as in this case, and he also lost his copyrights. So he had some financial troubles, even if he was very, very famous. He was very, very popular. He was very famous for his stand-up comedy, for example. He wrote about 20 novels. Now it's difficult to say it exactly for the reason I've just explained. He wrote short stories, and probably the most famous collection of short stories, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. And then obviously the two masterpieces, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Let's remember the Huckleberry Finn was actually a character of the first book, and then he, I mean, his story, his voice required a whole novel, a whole fiction on his own. Both of them are actually picaresque novels based on the adventures of these young guys that grow up, and as I told you before, there are a lot of elements that are that belong to Mark Twain's biography. The characters themselves. Huck was actually, let's say that the model, okay, for this character was an existing guy, okay, a real friend of Clemens. And also the places. The Mississippi River has always played a very important role in everything he wrote, in a lot of different stories and also travel narratives. And so the places, the cave Tom Sawyer runs away from was a real place. So he was inspired by life, basically. That's definitely children's literature, or literature for young people in any ways. But it's quite interesting. I mean, the fact that he also wrote this children's literature starting from a different point of view. So the point of view of the kid, the point of view of the children themselves, of the kids themselves. So that's not just a sort of a hymn to childhood, to boyhood, to youth, but it's also a way, I mean, let's say it's a way of talking from their point of view, of talking of their own reality, okay? He really, he knew a lot of the world. He traveled a lot. He knew a lot of different, he got in touch with a lot of different people, realities, social classes. He had different jobs and worked in different places. So his mentality was so open. He was so open-minded, and his insights were so, let's say, so pure somehow, and he had a variety of points of view, and that helped obviously also while writing. In this case it was a different point of view, so youth, but there are different examples of that in his works. There were also sequels to these works, but something especially important, and that concerns especially, that's about Huckleberry Finn, is the moral dilemma, is the moral question that this guy, Huck, has to face. A very simple guy with this who talks and uses his vernacular voice in a way, as a very simple guy who has to face such a complex situation, such a complex question. So the fact of hiding the runaway slave Jim. Let's say that Mark Twain used his voice, used Huck's voice in order to talk about his own beliefs. As I said before, he was an abolitionist, he was against slavery. So in this period when the topic was so controversial, was so difficult, he actually used this character, and he used the let's say the innocence of childhood, of youth, in order to convey this message. And what's quite strange is that this book was so controversial. As I said before, it was banned, it was let's say it was censored because of the N-word, but it wasn't just because of that, because to this day it is still controversial. There's still a debate about that, and especially about the tone, which is supposedly quite patronizing towards African Americans. That's the question. But actually the whole message was definitely very unconventional at the time, very strong, and he really spoke up for Afro-American people. However, back to his financial situation, which was actually quite a problematic leitmotif of his life. Let's say that the 1880s, of course, were actually probably the best years. They looked quite rosy. He had his publishing house. He worked with Ulysses S. Grant, who wrote the memoir of the US president. And Mark Twain, or Clemens, felt a bit, safer from a financial point of view, and he also thought about experimenting something new and writing memoirs himself. Especially he was thinking about writing the Pope's memoirs, but he didn't in the end, and he wrote a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. That's very interesting, and not just because it's about time traveling, and so, as I said before, it's something that is connected to his love for technology and science and this and that, but also because the idea is that of a democratic factory superintendent that is transported to Camelot, and he tries to transform it into a modern and technological place. The fact that he chooses Camelot is quite interesting, because we know that Camelot, of course it was a utopistic monarchy, and it was set in the Middle Ages. He belonged to the chivalric and heroic literature, so it was completely different. But at the time, that ideal, so Camelot as an ideal, was the representation of utopia, so the best kind of society ever. And he, Mark Twain in this case, wanted to transfer to that kind of utopistic environment his own society, where he had the chance to experiment meritocracy, and he really believed in what we are going to call the American dream. And so the idea of changing Camelot into this new meritocratic or modern society was quite meaningful, and the tropes are quite interesting, definitely very interesting, and it's a quite interesting experimentation. Then everything changed, because his publishing house sank, as we said before. Fortunately, he met this new friend, this Standard Oil executive Henry Rogers. He was a very good and close friend, and he also helped him from a financial point of view. Yeah, as we know, he spent his last years alone, especially because Rogers died. We know that his wife died too. He lost two daughters, and he definitely spent his life, his last years alone, but still working on his philanthropic causes. As I said in my previous video, he still worked and he still spoke up for the rights of the minorities or the social classes that were voiceless at the time, and even minorities like deaf-blind people. That was super interesting. That was incredibly, I mean, that was great if you think about it. Right after his death in 1980, Howells wrote My Mark Twain. And in this work, he called Mark Twain the Lincoln of literature. That was a great compliment, and that wasn't the only great compliment he received, because 25 years later, Ernest Hemingway wrote in The Green Hills of Africa in 1935, I'm gonna read it: "All modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain, called Huckleberry Finn." These two compliments are huge. Let's say that Hemingway's compliment is more aesthetic, because it refers to one specific novel that wasn't read at the time, because again, there was this debate about the slave Jim that was described in a diminishing way or whatever. But anyway, in Hemingway's mind, that work was a milestone somehow and set a new model for American writers. Howell's compliment is a bit different, less aesthetic and more social, because he compared Mark Twain to Lincoln, and he referred especially to Mark Twain's emancipated speeches, and the way he actually spoke up for the social classes that weren't considered at the time, so for minorities, let's say so. He was a moralist, as we said, and he was a humorist. Let's say that the best pieces are his short pieces. They are very true, and he can use these dialects, so they are very poignant and effective. The longer works are, let's say that the conception of the work is probably a bit better rather than the execution. That's the idea. Anyway, we can say by all means that he redefined entirely the genre of travel narrative. As I said before, he was able to use different points of view, in this case, as he did for, say, childhood literature. He was so gifted as far as characterization is concerned. In fact, he was compared to Dickens, and we know that Charles Dickens was actually was considered one of the best authors as far as characterization was concerned. His characters were very three-dimensional, and they were so well represented, so believable, the way they talked, the way they moved in their environment. He also wrote picaresque novels on Oliver Twist and David Copperfield and so on and so forth, so there is a possible comparison here. And together with Melville, Mark Twain was the only American intellectual American writer who actually talked against racism, and that was definitely very meaningful. He had an incredible mastery. He was able to master spoken language so well, vernacular language, slang, argot. In fact, Huckleberry Finn is an example of that, but many characters that come from different places and social classes are represented so well. They're so believable, they're so credible, also because of the way of the language they use, the way they speak, actually. And as I said before, his quite democratic ideas were expressed in a very vocal way and in a very direct way most of the times, without compromises. He had very large insights, and let's say that he didn't like compromises very much. As I said before, he was definitely a multifaceted personality, a multifaceted intellectual. As I said before, he was a humorist, a moralist, an entertainer, because he was definitely a public entertainer. When we talk about him being a stand-up comedian, he was definitely an entertainer. He had a relationship with the public. He was a political philosopher, travel writer, novelist, poet, because he also wrote some poems, especially when his daughter Susie and then his wife died. Yes, let's say that I mean, critics say that he actually invented the American point of view in fiction. That's something very important to say. That's a great achievement, because that determines a central point, a central role in culture, in the American culture for sure, but we also know how the American culture is also a point of reference for our culture, for the Western culture. So definitely that was a prominent role in the Western culture. So that's definitely probably when we talk about Mark Twain, we tend to think about adventure books or this and that, or maybe some stories that are the most popular ones, like The Prince and the Pauper, and that's great. But I mean, the role that he played was very, very important, and in his works we find the roots of the American literature to come, okay, and literature in general. So that's definitely a very important figure. There is so much to say about him, and I could talk about him for ages, but I'm not sure you want me to do that, so I'll stop here. I'll stop here, and I hope that these two videos have given you a sort of an idea of Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens, and I hope that you have a larger idea, and you know a bit more of this man and this intellectual, okay, and not just the novelist who wrote about Tom Sawyer. That's not just it. All right, thank you so very much for following. As usual, if you haven't clicked on the subscribe button, please do it now, and also on the bell. And again, I tell you every time, thank you so much to all of you who decide to support the channel using PayPal. The address is @Maiora, the name of the channel, tutor, okay, @Maiora tutor @gmail.com. It's the email you find in the description and you use to write when you want to tell me something. Okay, that's the same email you can use on PayPal, and that's the PayPal button on the homepage of this channel. And there's also a button here below with a heart, and it's a thank you button, and I thank you for supporting this channel. You know it's for free, and I want it to be for free for you. This is what I wanted to do. This is the philosophy of this channel. I've started this way and I keep doing this way, but your help and your support is so important for this activity. So thank you for sharing, for leaving your comments, for giving me your feedback, but also for your support to the cause. Thank you so very much. As usual, see you very soon, and in the meantime, take care.